Right now, it's impossible to say with certainty whether Israel and Iran are actually at peace or just taking a breath between blows. After nearly 2 relentless weeks of aerial assaults, covert operations, and what's now being called the largest stealth bombing mission in military history, something unexpected happened. Silence. Just as Iranian cities were still echoing from the shockwaves of Israeli air raids, and hours after American forces in Iraq came under a sudden hail of ballistic missiles, a string of surprise announcements reshaped the battlefield overnight. First came Washington, then Tehran, and finally Israel. One by one, each side publicly signaled a willingness to halt fire. No treaties, no photo ops, just a mutual, unspoken pause in a war that never officially began, but very nearly broke the entire region. But if you think this means peace is here, think again. As with everything in this long, tangled saga, the surface calm hides deeper uncertainty. No one really knows if this is a genuine ceasefire or just the eye of a much larger storm. The uneasy quiet could dissolve in minutes or hold long enough to shift the fate of the entire Middle East. What we just witnessed in the past 24 hours defies logic, even by the chaotic standards of this region. Monday, June 24th, delivered a chain of events so dramatic, so fast-moving, that even veteran analysts were caught off guard. Now, before we break it all down, here's a quick note. Everything you're about to hear is accurate as of 9 a.m. Tehran time, June 24th. I'm recording this at 8:35 a.m., so it's still very fresh and very fluid. By the time you're watching this, missiles could be flying again. Or, if we're lucky, diplomacy might be taking hold. But one thing is certain. This is the most fragile peace the region has seen in decades, and anything can happen next. At first, Monday looked like it was going to follow the same brutal script as every other day in this crisis. Israel would continue pounding Iranian territory from the skies. Iran would answer with missile salvos into Israeli cities. And the rest of the world would brace for what many feared was next, a direct Iranian strike on American forces, especially after Israeli air raids allegedly crippled parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And for most of Monday, that's exactly how things unfolded. But as the sun dipped below the horizon in Tehran, the tension began to thicken. Rumors swirled. Intelligence chatter intensified. Something was coming, and everyone knew it. In Qatar, home to one of the largest concentrations of U.S. military assets in the region, American troops were put on high alert. Civilians in military zones were quietly instructed to stay indoors. Across the Gulf, panic buttons were being pushed. Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE suddenly shut down their airspace without explanation. The signs were unmistakable: a strike was imminent. And then it happened. Iran launched 19 ballistic missiles, all aimed at a single target, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a massive American installation and strategic nerve center. Qatar's advanced U.S.-built Patriot missile defense systems sprang into action, intercepting 18 out of the 19 missiles. The one that got through struck an empty structure just outside the base's perimeter. No injuries, no fatalities, and minimal damage. At first glance, it looked like a dramatic escalation, Iran striking a U.S. base in broad daylight. But once the smoke cleared, analysts began to realize something odd. This wasn't a full-force attack. It was a signal. Iran, instead of targeting any of the numerous American military sites scattered across the region, chose only one. There were no drones, no decoys, no saturation tactic to overwhelm defenses. Just a single wave of missiles aimed at a base that, according to U.S. sources, had already seen its most critical aircraft and personnel dispersed weeks earlier. It was almost as if Tehran wanted to make a point, without triggering all-out war. And in this crisis, that subtle difference may be the only reason things didn't explode even further out of control. Then, quietly but unmistakably, the truth began to surface. Sources in Qatar confirmed what many had already suspected. Iran had tipped them off. Well before the missiles were launched, Tehran had notified Qatari officials that a strike was coming, a move that changed everything. Soon after, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, took to social media, characteristically blunt and theatrical. He dismissed the attack as little more than a well-orchestrated fireworks show. His exact words: "I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured." Both U.S. and Qatari sources confirmed the same. The strike was designed to miss, and it had. As more details emerged, Iran's strategy came into focus. The attack had served two very different audiences. Domestically, it was meant to satisfy Iranian hardliners demanding blood for blood. On state media, Iran proclaimed it had successfully hit back at the U.S., projecting strength and revenge. Internationally, it was a deliberate gesture of restraint, just enough aggression to save face, but carefully measured to avoid provoking a U.S. counterattack. In fact, it was so restrained that Iranian, Qatari, and American officials had reportedly met in advance to choreograph the missile intercepts. This wasn't just a scaled-back version of Iran's infamous 2020 retaliation for Qasem Soleimani's killing, it was even more symbolic, even more surgical. Back then, American troops suffered traumatic brain injuries. This time, Iran made sure the only casualties were the headlines. It was a message sent through smoke trails and silence. We could escalate, but we won't. Not yet. And in that space, a new possibility opened, one that Donald Trump would trumpet hours later in classic, all-caps fashion. Peace and harmony. A far cry from the war cries of just days earlier. Congratulations, world. It's time for peace. That was the headline Trump dropped on social media just hours after the missile drama played out in Qatar. And at first, most observers rolled their eyes, assuming, not unreasonably, that the president was being prematurely optimistic or just, well, Trump. But then something truly bizarre happened. Only a couple of hours after Iran fired missiles, and just as Iranians were settling in for a midnight snack, checking their phones like the rest of us, they were met with a headline that felt like it belonged in an alternate reality. Trump had posted again. In full Trump speak, he declared, "It has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire in approximately 6 hours from now, when Israel and Iran have wound down and completed their in-progress final missions." Yes, that's a real quote. And yes, the all-caps were his. Let's break it down. According to the Post, which, by the way, reportedly caught many of Trump's own senior advisors by surprise, Israel and Iran had quietly agreed to a phased ceasefire. The plan was strange, even by Middle Eastern standards. Both sides would continue military operations for 6 more hours, essentially wrapping up whatever missions were already underway. After that, Iran would enter a 12-hour ceasefire window, pausing all offensive operations. Israel, however, would continue its strikes during that time, meaning the ceasefire wasn't really mutual, not yet. Once Iran had held its fire for those 12 hours, Israel would follow suit, entering its own ceasefire period. If both countries could maintain restraint for a full 24-hour cycle, the undeclared war would officially be over. It was a staggered, uneven, and frankly confusing roadmap to peace. But if it held, just if the Middle East might suddenly find itself stepping back from the brink. Of course, this diplomatic arrangement wasn't announced through the State Department or confirmed in a formal press conference. No, the world learned about it through one man's Twitter feed, with no prior briefing to the press or even to the president's own national security team. But in the chaos of the region, maybe that's what made it feel believable. Peace arrived not with ceremony, but with a late-night post and a countdown clock. At first, the whole situation seemed too bizarre to be real. The rushed timeline, the unusual ceasefire mechanics, and of course, the way it was all unveiled via a late-night Trump tweet led many defense analysts to suspect it was all just bluster, a bluff, a distraction. But then, the pieces started falling into place. According to reporting from Axios, something very real was happening behind the scenes, a flurry of diplomacy that was as quiet as the missiles had been loud. It began just hours after Iran's missile strike on the American base in Qatar. Tehran reached out not directly to Washington, but through Qatari intermediaries. The message was short and clear. "We're done. No further attacks planned." Washington, for its part, responded through the same channel. The U.S. asked Qatar to relay a message back to Iran. "We don't intend to retaliate. In fact, we're open to restarting nuclear talks." That opened the door. What followed was a rapid and delicate exchange of terms, back and forth through Qatari officials. And then, in a direct phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump reportedly secured Israel's agreement, at least in principle, to stop its air campaign under specific conditions. Meanwhile, in Iran, messaging was as always complicated. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on air to declare that Iran had forced the West into a ceasefire deal, spinning it as a show of strength. Yet at almost the same time, Iran's supreme leader posted online that Iran would not accept any ceasefire imposed by the West. A contradiction? Not really. In Iranian politics, this kind of dual messaging is routine, with the supreme leader often making defiant public statements, while government officials quietly pursue more pragmatic deals behind closed doors. Still, As the agreed ceasefire time 4 a.m. Tehran time drew closer, the optimism started to wobble. In fact, just hours before the truce was meant to begin, Israeli warplanes launched one of their heaviest bombardments yet, targeting multiple neighborhoods across Tehran. Instead of winding down, the campaign seemed to be escalating as if Israel was trying to squeeze in as much damage as possible before the clock ran out. Whatever hope had been building began to buckle under the weight of new explosions. The moment of truth was approaching, but with bombs still falling and no official confirmation on either side, the world held its breath. Would the ceasefire hold? Or had everything unraveled before it even began? Up until the final minutes before the ceasefire was set to take effect, it looked like both sides were rushing to squeeze in their last punches. Iran fired off another round of ballistic missiles aimed at Israel, all of which were intercepted mid-air before they could reach their targets. Meanwhile, Israeli jets carried out a furious wave of bombing raids over Tehran and surrounding regions. It was as if both nations were racing the clock, trying to land symbolic blows before the window slammed shut. Then something changed. As the countdown hit 0, Israeli warplanes turned back. The roar of jet engines faded from Iranian skies. Iran's missile launches stopped. And suddenly, after nearly 2 weeks of nonstop bloodshed, a strange and powerful silence swept across the region. It was the quiet of exhausted violence, the kind of silence you can feel in your chest. Back in Washington, President Trump stepped in front of cameras to celebrate what he called a historic diplomatic achievement. When asked how long the ceasefire would last, he offered a typically confident and wildly optimistic answer. "I think the ceasefire is unlimited. It's going to go forever now." But forever turned out to last about 5 minutes. Despite Iran's official announcement of a ceasefire on national television, a new volley of ballistic missiles was launched toward Israel just moments after the truce had supposedly begun. At first, Israeli analysts wondered if it was an accident, the kind of tragic misfire that can happen in the fog of war. Iran's military infrastructure had been badly damaged. Maybe a rogue unit hadn't received the ceasefire orders in time. Maybe communications had broken down. But then came the second wave. As air raid sirens blared across Israeli cities, it became clear this wasn't a glitch. A larger barrage of missiles was inbound, and now, the ceasefire looked dead on arrival. Israeli air defenses roared to life again, scrambling to intercept. Most of the missiles were shot down, but not all of them. One missile slipped through. It struck a residential building in Beersheva, a bustling city in southern Israel. The impact was devastating. 4 people were killed instantly. 3 more were critically wounded, with doctors warning the death toll could still rise. In the span of minutes, the fragile illusion of peace had shattered. The quiet had been replaced once again by fire and sirens. Whatever hope had existed just hours earlier was now buried under rubble. All of this unfolded even after Iran had publicly declared a ceasefire on state television, and just minutes before the ceasefire deadline, President Trump had proudly broadcast to the world. Yet, in a surreal twist, while Iran was publicly announcing peace, Israeli airstrikes had already slowed, but Israel itself still hadn't made any official ceasefire declaration. Meanwhile, in Washington, the White House's entire communication strategy seemed to rest on a handful of social media posts from Donald Trump confidently claiming that the ceasefire was holding, even as missiles were still streaking through the air. Then came another turning point. After the third wave of Iranian missile strikes, there was a brief pause during which Iran appeared to wait for Israel to declare its own ceasefire. But with no such announcement from Jerusalem, Iran launched a 4th wave, then a 5th. Each round of missiles was intercepted by Israeli defense systems, but the rhythm of escalation was unmistakable. The final intercepts of this 5th barrage occurred just 5 minutes before Trump's ceasefire deadline was set to take effect at midnight, Washington time. As the clock ticked down, the region once again held its breath. Trump's deadline passed. Midnight hit, and for a few fleeting moments, the Middle East fell silent. But the silence didn't last. Just minutes later, Israel issued alerts warning of a 6th incoming missile barrage. Whatever calm had existed vanished again in a burst of air raid sirens and defense intercepts. Now, with Iran continuing to launch missiles even past the official ceasefire time, the Israeli government, speaking through sources close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, announced it was reevaluating its options. Iranian state media, however, claimed that the 6th barrage had actually been launched before the ceasefire began, and insisted that the truce should now be considered officially in effect. Whether Israel believes that or even cares remains uncertain. As of this moment, no seventh missile wave has been launched by Iran. But the next several hours will be critical. According to the structure Trump laid out earlier, Israel now has a 12-hour window to strike, while Iran is expected to hold its fire and honor its ceasefire commitment. And so far, Iran's foreign ministry is framing this delicate ceasefire not as surrender but as a strategic victory. Iran's state media framed its final waves of missile launches as continuing until the last minute, a phrase that now seems intended to signal Tehran's willingness to honor the ceasefire moving forward, as laid out in Trump's phased plan. But whether that actually holds is anyone's guess. Israel now faces the grim reality of at least 4 civilian deaths, victims of an Iranian missile that slipped through their defenses and struck a residential building. The tragedy occurred during what can only be described as a gray zone, a period of limbo when one side had declared a ceasefire and the other had not, or at least hadn't made it official. How Israel chooses to interpret those deaths and how it reads Iran's broader behavior in the hours leading up to the ceasefire will likely determine the scale of its response. If Israel views the attacks as a betrayal, it could justify major retaliation under the ceasefire's asymmetric terms. And if Israel does strike back hard, Iran could quickly lose interest in an agreement that essentially demands it sit still while its cities remain under fire. But beyond the volatile next 12 hours, this fragile ceasefire leaves behind some critical, unanswered questions, none more urgent than this. Is Iran still fully in control of its own military? While evidence now suggests that the latest missile barrages were state-sanctioned, not the work of rogue units, earlier fears about breakaway Revolutionary Guard factions weren't entirely misplaced. In a nation where parallel chains of command exist, especially within the IRGC, the risk of unauthorized military action remains dangerously real. Even if this ceasefire holds, and that's still a big if, Iran's leadership will have to move quickly to reassert tight control over all of its military branches. One rogue missile, one defiant commander, or one act of provocation could shatter this fragile truce and pull both nations back into a spiral of war. Because this isn't just about today's peace, it's about whether peace can survive the night. Israel, for its part, now faces a major challenge. How do you distinguish between a state-sanctioned attack and a rogue act from soldiers who no longer speak for Tehran? That distinction will become critical if the ceasefire is to mean anything. But whether either side is capable of showing the restraint and clarity required in such a chaotic scenario remains highly uncertain. And then there's the elephant in the room, the Iranian people. With the guns temporarily silent, international attention now shifts to what's happening inside Iran itself, and the regime may not like what it sees. Despite Tehran's official narrative that it forced the West to back down, a large segment of the Iranian population doesn't buy it and has long been deeply disillusioned with the regime. Over the past several years, waves of massive protests, often brutally suppressed, have revealed just how fragile the regime's grip on public loyalty really is. Now, with the ceasefire in place, tensions could resurface in new and dangerous ways. On one hand, Iran's hardliners may choose to embrace the official story that Tehran humiliated the West and dictated the terms of peace. But on the other hand, those same hardliners, especially among the more radical military factions, could accuse the regime of backing down too early, of projecting weakness instead of strength when it mattered most. Worse still, the ceasefire could become a flashpoint uniting the regime's harshest critics from both extremes. Anti-regime civilians, who see the leadership as corrupt and out of touch. Hardline insiders, who believe Iran missed its moment to crush its enemies. If these two forces' ideological opposites begin to find common cause in their dissatisfaction, Iran could be headed into something far more dangerous than another foreign conflict. The prospect of domestic regime instability or even a military coup becomes a real concern, especially given that parts of the Revolutionary Guard already operate with a high degree of autonomy. In short, a fragile truce on the outside could trigger a storm on the inside. Even as Iranian forces scramble to regain control and Israel recalibrates its next move, another front in this tangled conflict quietly ignited, one that could prove even harder to contain. On Monday and early Tuesday, a series of explosive drone attacks hit military sites in the stretch of territory between Iran and Israel. In Iraq, drone strikes targeted radar systems, suspected Iranian military facilities, and even a base housing U.S. troops. Crucially, these strikes are not believed to have originated from Iran itself. Instead, attention quickly turned to a familiar but unpredictable set of players, Iran-backed militias operating across Iraq and Syria. These proxy groups, often loosely affiliated with Tehran, are capable of acting independently or in coordination with Iran's deeper strategic goals. But their timing was explosive. Just as Iran appeared to be embracing a ceasefire, or at least testing the waters, its militia allies were actively escalating. And that creates a dangerous new wildcard. Because even if Iran is ready to stand down, these groups may not be. And if they provoke further American or Israeli retaliation, the entire ceasefire structure could collapse before it has a chance to hold. Zooming out, the landscape is littered with unanswered questions. For Iran, what's the true status of its nuclear enrichment program? How badly were its nuclear facilities damaged in recent strikes? Is the supreme leader alive and actively in control, or still in hiding, or worse? And how many of Iran's military capabilities are actually still intact? For Israel, how has this conflict reshaped the political fate of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Just how depleted are Israel's air defense systems and missile stockpiles? And will Israel really stay silent for 12 hours while Iran waits, or will it find an excuse to strike again? And then there's the most important question of all. Can this ceasefire even hold? Will it last until the time you're watching this episode? Or is ceasefire just another word for a temporary pause between two rounds of war? Right now, Combat Insight Alpha can't give you final answers. But we will be back as soon as new intelligence and battlefield updates come in. Until then, thank you for watching. Stay sharp, stay informed, and stay ready.